The Johnsons came in to offer their condolences. Johnson called her honey, put his arm around her and shook his head, but he left the expressions of commiseration to his wife. Mrs. Johnson was a woman, and Mrs. Kennedy liked her. Her face crumpling with tears, the new First Lady said, "Oh, Jackie, you know we never even wanted to be Vice President, and now, dear God, it's come to this." "Oh, what if I hadn't been there?" Jacqueline Kennedy said. "I was so glad I was there." Mrs. Johnson was ordinarily the essence of tact, yet here she slipped. "I don't know what to say," she sobbed, and then she said it. "What wounds me most of all is that this should happen in my beloved state of Texas." She had scarcely finished before she realized that her tongue had tripped. Immediately, as she said later, "I regretted it." This was no day for Texas chauvinism. Kennedy's death should be what wounded her the most. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess Cannell, and if you're new, then welcome. I'd like to earn your subscription today. Well, this next, we'll call it 2 weeks probably. We're going to give ourselves a spring break that lasts about 2 weeks, and I plan to fill it with all things Kennedy. So I did this back in November for the JFK assassination memorial, or for the anniversary of his assassination. And it was so fun to just do a deep dive into all things Kennedy. So over the next few weeks, we are going to be reading through some of the rest of this account, which is from William Manchester. It's all about his book, The Death of a President, which was commissioned by Jackie Kennedy as the description of the Kennedy assassination. There were thousands of pages, hundreds of interviews. He got the inside look at how these days went. And so we started in November going through these page by page. And we are now in what was a serialized publication. We are in the part 3 version of this. So I'm just going to pick up where we left off in November. But I also want to give you a quick highlight of some of the other things we're going to read about during the next couple of weeks. So we are going to go through this series, hopefully. I hope to get all the way through the collection of Look magazines that I have. So whatever I have on this book, we will go through. Now, I actually do own a copy of the book. So at some point I may continue reading from the book, but this is the serialized version from Look magazine that was published in 1967. So these will be scattered throughout the next couple of weeks. We will also do, I think we're going to do a look at just a brighter look of Jackie Kennedy's White House years. We are going to do a 2-part video series on Joe Kennedy, and specifically his perspective on parenting. So it gives a look at how he responded and interacted with his children, the kinds of ingredients that went into raising Kennedys, and that ultimate attitude that they brought to the table of, we are going to raise winners. Only winners. And so that was an account that is fascinating that I can't wait to go through with you, and other articles as well. I have a whole stack of magazines at this point that relate to the Kennedys, so I'm going to be choosing from them over the next 2 weeks to bring you delicious, dicey, incredible articles that I hope you'll love. So come back. Hopefully almost every day you'll have something served up new about the Kennedys. And then after all of this, we will return to our regular programming. So those of you who aren't into all things Kennedy, after spring break, we'll get back to normal viewing. Well, today, let's go ahead and get right into it. Like I said, this is by William Manchester, and this section is specifically titled Flight from Dallas, the abrasive relationship between Kennedy and Johnson partisans during the hours aboard Air Force One. So one thing I've loved just from the first sections that we read of William Manchester's writing, the level of detail is fantastic. but also he includes certain details that many of us, I know many of you commented after those episodes, many of us had never encountered some of these stories. So he got firsthand accounts that sometimes we've never encountered anywhere else. So this is fascinating writing, and I can't wait to share it with you. The long burnished coffin was closed and poised on its church truck. Jacqueline Kennedy stamped out a cigarette and began to fidget and look around impatiently. She was ready. The undertaker was ready. Parkland, having done all it could, had turned to new emergencies. Yet they weren't moving. The trauma room door was propped open, and the IBM clock there revealed that they had been in the hospital for an hour and a half. "Sergeant, why can't I get my husband back to Washington?" Bob Duggar knew why, but he wasn't going to brief her. The newest development made Dallas look like a hick town, he thought. As a Texan, he felt humiliated. The other men had tacitly agreed to keep it from her, and amazingly, they were successful. It was the loudest and longest uproar of the afternoon. It raged all around her for over half an hour and nearly ended in a fistfight a few feet from her. Yet not until much later in Washington did she understand just why they had all been delayed so long. Roy Kellerman had been the first agent to scent trouble. Shortly before the coffin arrived, Roy had been standing in the nurse's station with Dr. George Berkeley, the president's personal physician, hanging on to a phone connection with the White House, when a pale, freckled, wall-eyed man in shirt sleeves entered, reached for another phone, and flipped the receiver off snappily like a gunman in a Western. He said, "This is Earl Rose. There has been a homicide here. They won't be able to leave until there has been an autopsy." Father Kane had been a temporary distraction. Rose was a stage heavy. The priest had meant well. At most, he believed himself afterwards. He had been a victim of the national distress. Rose was not a man to be plagued by self-doubt, and he was unaccustomed to criticism from others. He was the Dallas County medical examiner, with an office in the hospital. Pedantic and brittle, he had a way of wagging his finger and adopting the stylized tone of an overbearing schoolmaster. He seemed to invite hostility. His colleagues thought him arrogant and smart. He was certainly bright. He knew a great deal of Texas law, and he treated it as revealed religion. Dura lex, said lex. The law is hard, but it's the law. That was his attitude. Unlike the priest, the doctor was to suffer no feeling of shame afterward. He worked himself into white-hot anger that afternoon, and he was so sure he was right that his wrath never ebbed. A year later, the mere mention of the battle he had fought on November 22nd was enough to make him tremble. As a physician and a Dallas appointee, he represented both the medical and legal professions. He could be an obstacle of formidable bulk if he chose to be, and he so chose. To him, the situation at Parkland was clear and clearly outrageous. A man had been killed in Dallas. Other men were trying to remove the corpse in open defiance of Texas statutes. They were flouting rights, of which Dr. Earl Rose was the appointed guardian. Strong action was required, and he meant to take it. Rose hung up and turned to leave the nurse's station. Kellerman blocked the way. In his most deliberate drawl, Roy said, "My friend, this is the body of the President of the United States, and we are going to take it back to Washington." "No, that's not the way things are," Rose wagged his finger. "When there's a homicide, we must have an autopsy." "He is the president. He is going with us." Rose lashed back. "The body stays." "My friend, my name is Roy Kellerman. I'm special agent in charge of the White House detail of the Secret Service. We are taking President Kennedy back to the Capitol." "You're not taking the body anywhere. There's a law here. We are going to enforce it." Dr. Berkeley argued with Dr. Rose, physician to physician. It was useless. Kellerman, who hadn't moved from the doorway, loomed forward. "My friend, this part of the law can be waived." Rose, stonewalling, shook his head. "You will have to show me a lot more authority than you have now," said Kellerman. "I will," Rose said, reaching for the phone. He could, too. Now that John Kennedy was no longer a living president, his mortal remains were in the custody of the state. Rose phoned the sheriff's office and the homicide bureau of the police department. Both agreed that an autopsy was mandatory. Under the law, they had little choice. Given the uncertainty of the hour and the absence of federal jurisdiction, Rose had an ironclad case. Assassination is murder. Murder is a felony, and in felonious crimes, he had a legal obligation to Dallas County. That was why he had an office in Parkland Hospital. Justice must be served. When, and if captured, the assassins or assassin had rights. Among them, the right of access to the findings of an impartial post-mortem examination. The point is arguable, of course, because by now it ought to have been categorically clear to Rose that the Secret Service would maintain a vigilant watch over Kennedy's body, and had he been realistic, he would have realized that an assassination without a scrupulous post-mortem was unthinkable. Nevertheless, there was area for reasonable debate. His error, which was grave, was that he was not behaving reasonably. Berkeley begged him to reconsider. Mrs. Kennedy is going to stay exactly where she is until the body is moved. We can't have that. What Mrs. Kennedy did was of no concern to Rose. She could come or go as she liked. She was alive and had been accused of no infraction of the law. His sole interest was in the cadaver. The remains stay, he said flatly. Procedures must be followed. A certificate has to be filed before anybody can be shipped out of the state. I can release the body to a Texas JP who will function as coroner, or hold the body and have an autopsy here. It's the President of the United States, Berkeley cried. That doesn't matter. You can't lose the chain of evidence. Dave Powers heard about the dispute and came over incredulous. Rose explained everything to him in detail, then shook his head impatiently when Powers urged him to make an exception in this case. Regulations, the examiner said, his voice frozen. General Godfrey McHugh approached Rose and was told, there are state laws about removing bodies. You people from Washington can't make your own law. McHugh appealed to Dallas Mayor Earl Cable, who said that he had no authority to intervene. Then to a member of Parkland's administrative staff who said that Rose was absolutely right. Then to a policeman in civilian clothes who suggested that a justice of the peace might be able to do something. How long will that take? McHugh asked. 10 or 15 minutes, said the man. When we're ready, we're leaving, McHugh said indignantly. Berkeley suggested that Rose come along on the plane. Rose shook his head. The law made no provision for such a trip. General Ted Clifton remembered that he had talked to Attorney General Wagner Carr of Texas during the flight to Dallas from Fort Worth on aircraft 26,000, and he asked that he be paged over the PA system. The page was broadcast. Carr did not materialize. In retrospect, the furor that the medical examiner raised seems remarkable. He was a man of authority, but there ought to have been some way of diverting him. His strength was largely a strength of will. The only Parkland doctor to side openly with the dead chief executive's staff was Kemp Clark. Jack, is there a JP in the building? He asked Jack Price, the hospital administrator. For God's sake, find someone. Mayor Cable and individual members of the staff began calling outside on their own initiative. JP after JP was reported to be out to lunch. Finally, a JP named Theron Ward was located and asked to come to Parkland immediately. Theron Ward could not comply immediately or anything like it. He was JP for Precinct 3, and that was in Garland, Texas, 14 miles away. While everyone was waiting for him, the row around Earl Rose grew in intensity. Dr. Rose talked to D.A. Henry Wade, who had advised him to step aside and let the Secret Service handle everything. A less combative man would have welcomed that escape hatch, but Rose didn't want to escape. Instead, he became more vehement. Kemp Clark and Rose exchanged bitter words, and afterward, Clark took the worried Jack Price aside and advised him that he favored using force. It may come to pinning him down and sitting on him, he warned, adding that he would be delighted to be among the sitters. He was one of many. If Rose had intended to preempt the center of the stage, he was meeting with spectacular success. Outside Parkland, J.P. Theron Ward added his tan Buick coupe to the tangled junkyard. He might as well have arrived in a tumbril. A justice of the peace could make no peace between the militants and Major Medicine. He could only mangle his own reputation. Ward was nearly saved from his fate. At the entrance, he introduced himself to a Secret Service man as the JP and was promptly ejected. The misunderstanding arose from his title. On the eastern seaboard, a JP is a minor functionary, a rung or two above a notary public. In Texas, he is an elected magistrate with a courtroom and a daily docket. Judge Ward was accustomed to a more dignified reception, and when he presented himself at another entrance, he got it from a nurse who led him to the nurse's station. She looked grateful to see him and said so, which was the last kind word he was to hear for some time. Earl Rose recognized him. His eyes lit up. He crooked his finger peremptorily, the adverb is Ward's, and cried, "Judge Ward, you are under the gun. This case must be handled as no other case in history has been handled. If you allow this body to be moved, it will be moved illegally." During the hasty introductions that followed, Ward attempted to explain his role to the glowering federal officials who flanked the medical examiner. "I'm the JP who will be handling the case," he said to Dr. Berkeley, attempting to take Berkeley's arm. The arm was withdrawn. Rose's attitude had discredited Ward in advance, creating a violent revulsion toward local law. To the Washingtonians, moreover, the judge didn't seem to be much of a jurist. Kellerman, like the agent who had turned him away, was unimpressed by the title of JP. Ward's physical presence was no help. A prepossessing newcomer, a Texan, with the lordly bearing of a Connolly, might have dominated the quarrel. The judge was short, slight, sandy-haired, and young. Finally, he appeared to be indecisive. "I'll handle everything as quickly as possible," he assured Kellerman and Berkeley. They eyed him skeptically and felt vindicated when in the very next breath he marched back down the hill. He begged for a few minutes to check a point of law. Actually, his request was entirely reasonable. He was in strange country and plainly needed a guide. Elsewhere in the same city at that very moment, a federal judge and the U.S. attorney for 100 counties were vexed by a relatively simple question of the presidential oath. During his debut, at least, Ward deserved a sympathetic hearing. So that reference to the oath is that, I believe we may have read it in the last section, but it's been in November. Yeah, I think they realized they would need the exact wording of the presidential oath. None of them thought to check the Constitution where it is written in exact phrasing, but they were calling around to various judges, trying to find what is the actual wording, and then also trying to find a judge who would administer the oath to LBJ. So that's happening elsewhere. He is handling his own legal issue. During his debut, at least, Ward deserved a sympathetic hearing. He didn't get it. The men with whom he was pleading were in a fever of resentment. Their tempers couldn't take another degree of heat. Shattered by the murder, antagonized toward all Texans because of it, they had been harried past endurance by the inimical medical examiner. Kellerman displayed his commission book. "My friend, Your Honor, isn't there something in your law that makes a waiver possible?" "I'm sorry," Ward said unhappily. "I know who you are, but I just can't help you under the circumstances." As Ward was talking, Kellerman had noticed that the church truck was being rolled into view. Jacqueline Kennedy was standing behind it, her hand resting lightly on the bronze top. Clint Hill, Godfrey McHugh, Sergeant Duggar, and O'Neill were bunched around her. O'Donnell, O'Brien, Powers, Clifton, and Gonzalez, and Andy Berger flanked the church truck. Earl Rose stood blocking the wide door through which the coffin would pass. It had come to that. Wow. At this point, everything becomes confused. Judge Ward, who watched the beginning of the scene from the nurse's station, afterward believed that the encounter was over in a matter of moments. In fact, it was prolonged. According to the nurses who were watching Parkland's IBM clocks, Rose's last stand lasted 10 minutes. Each man has his own story, and all clash because all are saturated with emotion. Mrs. Kennedy, who had the clearest eye there, would be an invaluable witness, but she was deliberately sequestered. Gonzalez saw Rose hold up one flat hand like a traffic cop. "We can't release anything," Rose said. "A violent death requires a post. It's our law." The Dallas medical examiner seemed to be in a tantrum. His arms were flapping. His shirt was disheveled. He was livid. The blood had left his freckled face, giving him the complexion of cold oatmeal. That's quite a perspective, the complexion of cold oatmeal. Before I just had to turn the page, and I wanted to show you this advertisement. It has Goodyear. It says more people ride on Goodyear tires than any other kind, and that's been true for 52 consecutive years. And they have vehicles going from the 1966 Mustang, and including lots of beauties, all the way back to the 1915 Buick, which is a beautiful ad. Be fun to look through each one of these vehicles and just see what's included here. He was speaking, so this is Rose, remember the complexion of oatmeal. He was speaking rapidly in a shrill, animated voice, which to Gonzalez sounded like a screech. Following the thread of his thought was hard, but he appeared to be lecturing them on the protection of the innocent, the accused day in court. The credo of the physician and the sanctity of the Texas statutes of the federal employees were attempting to profane. The men around the coffin decided to adopt Kemp Clark's suggestion. If necessary, they would hold him down. A signal was passed, O'Donnell to Kellerman to the other Secret Service agents. Rose was surrounded by muscle. "You can't leave now," he gabbled at Ken, bounding up and down to keep the coffin in view. A little guy, you can just imagine him. "You can't move it." A crush of sweating men had developed around the door. The door had been forced open, and people were wedging their way in from the corridor beyond. Theron Ward estimated the crowd at 40. Until now, Rose had been a lonely figure, but this was still Dallas. He was still a public official, and a medical examiner's natural allies were Dallas policemen. One of them was among the arrivals from the outer hall. He took up a position at Rose's side. It looked as though they might have to hold more than one man down, and if the patrolman intervened actively, he would be no pushover. He was fingering a pistol. Oh my goodness. As O'Donnell and O'Brien were shouldering their way toward Rose, they were stopped by Berkeley and McHugh, who proposed another solution. They explained that a justice of the peace was present and that he had the power to overrule the medical examiner. Everyone waited while the judge was summoned. Then he arrived and disappointed them. He could do nothing, he said. If a JP suspected a homicide, it was his duty to order an autopsy. There were plenty of grounds for suspicion here, and he couldn't overlook them. He guessed the procedure wouldn't take more than 3 hours. O'Donnell asked that an exception be made for President Kennedy. Although the din was atrocious, both he and O'Brien heard the justice of the peace say, with what they regarded as a distinctly unsympathetic inflection, "It's just another homicide case as far as I'm concerned." Although the din was atrocious, both he and O'Brien heard the justice of the peace say, with what they regarded as distinctly unsympathetic inflection, "It's just another homicide case as far as I'm concerned." The effect on O'Donnell was instantaneous. He uttered an oath. Thrusting his head forward until their noses nearly grazed, he said, "We're leaving." The policeman beside Rose pointed to the medical examiner and the justice of the peace and told O'Brien, "These two guys say you can't go." "One side," Larry said curtly. Jerking his head, Ken said, "Get the hell over. We're getting out of here. We don't give a damn what these laws say. We're not staying here 3 hours or 3 minutes. He called to Dave, who had taken Jackie to a nearby cubicle. "We're leaving now." To Kellerman, he snapped, "Wheel it out." At this juncture, in O'Donnell's words, It became physical. Us against them. Kellerman, who hadn't even heard Ken, had begun to pull the church truck on his own, butting flesh with his shoulders. The agents and Sergeant Duggar were pushing. It is impossible to say who was obstructing them, because in the melee, several men who seemed to be barring their progress had been daunted and were simply trying to get out of the way. Earl Rose wasn't among them. His patrolman had capitulated, and he had been shoved away from the threshold. Neither was Theron Ward. He was in the nurses' station, calling to the district. He was calling the DA. To Ward, as to Earl Rose earlier, the DA explained that he had no objection to the removal of the body. Holding the receiver with his right hand, the judge waved toward the men at the door with his left hand, motioning them to go ahead. The value of the gesture is doubtful. It was like signaling to the bowl game scrimmage from a cheap seat. The scrap was already resolved. The last wavering human obstacle faded away, and the coffin rolled into the corridor. The widow was walking directly behind it, her gloved hand once more on the gleaming cover. As they approached the ambulance dock, an orderly raced up and handed an agent a blank certificate of death signed by Kemp Clark. It was swiftly pocketed. By now, the formation was moving forward in a rush, and in the disarray, Dr. Berkeley and Agent Bill Greer were left behind. It was in a panic to get out of there, O'Brien recalled afterward. That little lady just couldn't stand there with her husband's body that way. Father Kane was propelled to the dock edge, where he continued his incantations. Remember that from the last episode? If you missed it, go back and see that one. It's crazy what this priest did at the end. He totally shook up Jackie. He was pretty odd in his behaviors. It's worth hearing. It's an account I had never heard before. Well, he's giving incantations while the staff, coached by O'Neill, eased the president into his ambulance hearse's cargo compartment. There was a door on the right-hand side leading to a jump seat beside the coffin. Sergeant Duggar, who was nearest, opened it for Jackie Kennedy. It was exactly 2:08 p.m. The prospect of a pitched battle in the presence of the young widow had intimidated them all. They were determined to reach the airport and take off before imaginary reinforcements could arrive and overpower them. Even as Agent Andy Berger ran his fingers over the unfamiliar controls, those fears seemed justified. Men were banging on the doors, demanding admittance. They really weren't as forbidding as they seemed. One was O'Neill's driver, the other, O'Neill himself. "Let me in!" shrilled the driver, to whom Berger was a trespasser. His employer was less strident. The undertaker wasn't concerned. He was under the extraordinary impression that the funeral would be in Dallas, and he merely wanted to establish a rendezvous. "Do you know the way to my mortuary?" he called to Roy. "I'll meet you there." "We're not going there," Roy replied. "We're going to Love Field. Follow us and you can pick up your ambulance." "Hearse," O'Neill instinctively corrected him. Then he turned to Hugh Sidey of Time and expressed concern over who would pay him. Sidey stared at him, then glanced at the small semicircle of curiosity seekers in front of the tangled parking lot, at the wintry pile of the hospital overhead, and out to the neoned boulevard where the 6-lane stream of blatting traffic halted and moved as the signal lights mechanically turned red, amber, green. Sordid, he thought. What a sordid place for the glory of the Kennedy era to end. Next chapter. At Love Field, as the stewards locked 26,000's rear door, Jacqueline Kennedy wanted to be by herself for a few minutes. The last time she and Jack had been alone together, she remembered, they had been in the private cabin. He had loved the room. So had she. She decided that would be the right place for her to compose herself. So they've given us, helpfully, this little map. And yes, this page came out. It already was detached, so I'm just going to hold it up here for you. But it gives a little inside look as to how the cabin was laid out. And it also gives a description, which I'm going to show to you or read to you. So it says there's the cockpit, a WC or a bathroom, the community shack, forward galley, crew's quarters, so So I guess that's the crew's quarters. Then a staff and press area, stateroom. So that was a place for the president to do business. President's bedroom is there. A hallway is here on this side. There was a private bathroom for the president, a little closet for the president, and then the staff and Secret Service area in the back with an aft galley, a closet, two bathrooms for the two of them, and an auxiliary power engine room at the reverse. So she comes in, I believe the back, did it say the back? Rear door, yes. So she came in the rear door, and she thinks this president's bedroom is going to be the place for her to collect her thoughts for a moment. He had loved the room, so had she, so she decided that would be the right place for her to compose herself. Stepping softly, she moved down the dim corridor. Because she regarded the bedroom as hers, she did not knock. She simply grasped the latch and twisted it. Inside, reclining on the bed, was Lyndon Johnson, dictating to Marie Famer. Mrs. Kennedy came to a dead stop. The new president heaved himself up and hastily lumbered past her. Marie swiftly gathered her notebooks and pencils and followed Johnson out. The widow stared after them. For an instant, she paused indecisively on the bright blue carpet with the golden presidential eagle worked into it. Then she returned to the corridor. The relentless tension of the past 2 hours was beginning to lift a little for many of those on the plane. They had all missed the Trade Mart lunch, and now they were hungry. Johnson called for a bowl of soup. In Marie Famer's words, he just inhaled the soup and crackers. They were gone in a flash. Putting the dish aside, he sighed. It's been a year since I got up. Mrs. Kennedy returned to the tail cabin to stay with the coffin. Godfrey McHugh, meantime, had reached the nose of the aircraft. He had not seen either Johnson or Mrs. Johnson and was preoccupied with the need for immediate departure now that President Kennedy's body was aboard. Entering the staff cabin, he was relieved to hear a familiar whine. Pilot Jim Swindle on his own had started the No. 3 engine, the sign that a hop was imminent. Calling ahead, McHugh shouted, "Take off! The president is aboard." 2 presidents were aboard, though McHugh had not thought of it that way. And Johnson's decision to take his oath in Dallas was about to cause an increase in the inevitable tension between the Johnson and Kennedy people. During the past 2 hours, the Kennedy staff had lost a president and then battled to remove his coffin from the hospital. They had faced a more buffeting than most people experience in a lifetime. Their tempers were tender. If Johnson had directed them to take the plane parked alongside rather than Air Force One, they would have been spared the climax of their anguish. Yet perspective suggests compassion. Johnson was the president, whether or not they could bring themselves to acknowledge him as such. And as Robert McNamara observed later, you must remember that he was in a state of shock, too. To their credit, the Kennedy staff members concealed their scars during those early hours, realizing that any public rift with the emerging administration would be a disservice to the country, and in consequence, to the man they mourned. Swindle's crew was enormously proud of the speed with which they could become airborne and drilled constantly to shave seconds. Godfrey McHugh assumed that the first engine whine would be followed by a quick taxiing into position and a lifting sensation. It had always been that way. This was to be an exception, however. The man who was to signal a change in the regular procedure was Mac Kilduff, a Kennedy man who had ridden to the airport in the breakneck caravan behind the hearse. Johnson had summoned the acting press secretary, whose calmness at Parkland had impressed him, and asked him to take the lead in setting things up for Sarah Hughes. "I've got to be sworn in here," Johnson told Kilduff. "I've talked to the Attorney General." Mac reacted quickly. The flight to Washington, he realized, would have to be postponed. He headed for Swindle, and as he darted forward, he must have passed McHugh, one of several near misses for McHugh that can only be understood in the light of the turmoil in the staff area. "Cut it off," Mac told Swindle. He offered no explanation, but he was a member of the presidential staff. The pilot obediently reached for his instruments. McHugh approached the nose of the aircraft seconds later and called, "Take off! The president is aboard!" "No, we can't," Swindoll called back. "Let's go. Mr. Kilduff says we can't." "It doesn't matter what anybody says. Move," McHugh commanded. He was a general. Swindoll was a colonel. McHugh returned aft, assuming he would be obeyed. Johnson, who had asked Kilduff whether there were any photographers present, entered the bedroom's powder room to change his shirt and comb his hair. For the second time, McHugh missed an encounter by seconds, though it is doubtful that his attitude would have changed much if they had. To him, Lyndon Johnson was still Lyndon, the vice president, and vice presidents, far from issuing decrees to the men surrounding presidents, defer to them. Johnson had tacitly acknowledged this at Parkland when he turned a deaf ear to Youngblood and Agent Emory Roberts, refusing to leave what they regarded as a potential death trap until O'Donnell had given him permission to go. Since then, he had grasped the enormity of what had happened and had become President Johnson in his own eyes. But Godfrey McHugh saw things differently. He was an emotional man. He had already decided to renounce his Texas citizenship, and under the present circumstances, he would regard an instruction from Johnson as an impertinence. The cabin in the tail grew more humid. Jacqueline Kennedy said, "It's so hot. Let's leave." "Didn't you tell them?" Ken O'Donnell asked McHugh. "Yes, but Matt Kilduff told them something else. I'll go up again." In the communications shack, he ran into Kilduff. Mac was out of breath. He had been attending to assorted details, assembling a makeshift press pool, and rehearsing White House photographer Captain Cecil Stoughton and his cameras for the ceremony. Even so, his unintelligibility with McHugh is remarkable. He could have hardly been more obscure had he tried. "What's going on?" McHugh demanded. "We're waiting for newspaper people." "The hell with newspaper people. We're going to go." "We have to wait for Lady Bird's luggage. It's not here yet." "What? She's on her own plane." "No, she's here, and we're waiting for a Texas judge, a lady." He still hasn't said, you'll notice, "We're administering the oath of office." That's what all this is waiting for. So there's this miscommunication between the two parties where Kennedy's people are like, "Let's get in the air. We all fought to get away from the hospital. Let's just get going." And they're all saying, "We've got to wait for the oath of office," except that hasn't been said. He's just giving all these little details, and it shows the shock of the moment. Back to the rear compartment, Ken O'Donnell asked McHugh, "Well, I don't know what's happening. We're waiting for a woman judge, some reporters, and Mrs. Johnson's baggage," McHugh reported. He knew it sounded idiotic, but that was what he had been told. O'Donnell's face drew to a point, as though the muscles had been tightened by a single drawstring within. You can see that. That's interesting. "You leave right now." "This time we're going," McHugh promised grimly. He could replace Swindoll and fly the plane himself if he had to. In the corridor outside the bedroom, he hesitated. Mac had specifically mentioned Lady Bird. It seemed preposterous to McHugh, but perhaps something had happened to the backup plane. Perhaps Johnson himself was also aboard. By his own account, McHugh made 5 journeys through the length of the aircraft before he found out why they weren't moving. Wandering into the staff cabin, Larry O'Brien heard someone ask Marie Famer if she had typed the presidential oath of office. She nodded, and Larry comprehended everything. At about the same time, O'Donnell overheard a discussion in the stateroom, and someone called out, "We need a photographer, and we're waiting for a judge." Ken, though he disapproved, understood what was meant. McHugh alone remained in the dark. The conflict had become irreconcilable. The Kennedy party believed that Air Force One's chief passenger was their fallen leader. Since he could not give them orders, they looked to Mrs. Kennedy, who shared their feeling that they must quit Dallas, and who was bewildered by the delay. The attitude of the Johnson party, on the other hand, was summed up by Youngblood, who drew Lem Johns aside during the turmoil and emphatically told him, "When the boss says we go, then we go." McHugh reached the front of the plane for the 3rd time. He spotted Matt Kilduff. Bounding toward him, Kilduff had the impression that he was galloping, and he said hotly, "We've got to take off immediately." "Not until Johnson has taken the oath," said Kilduff. "Johnson isn't here. He's on the backup plane." Then you go back and tell that 6-foot Texan he isn't Lyndon Johnson, Kilduff said. We're not going to Andrews until the president has been sworn. McHugh flushed. Pointing toward the tail compartment, he cried, I have only one president, and he's lying back in that cabin. Whew, these are emotional reactions. It was a dramatic remark, and the plane was small enough so that his words became known to virtually every passenger before they landed at the Capitol. Ken O'Donnell heard them and was proud of the general. This morning, you were this tall, he said, holding his hand a few inches from the floor. Then he raised it as high as he could reach and said, now you're up here. But Lyndon Johnson had ears too. That brief exchange in the communications shack altered the destinies of the two men. Kilduff, whom O'Donnell had dismissed, had laid claim to a job in a new administration, while General McHugh had forfeited his hope for another star. Indeed, his days in uniform were now numbered. Interesting. The things that are said in emotional states. Yep. After the new president had changed his shirt and combed his hair, Joe Ayers laid out some blue Air Force One towels for Jacqueline Kennedy. She thanked him and entered the bedroom, and the Johnsons came in to offer their condolences. Johnson called her honey, put his arm around her and shook his head, but he left the expressions of commiseration to his wife. Mrs. Johnson was a woman, and Mrs. Kennedy liked her. Her face crumpling with tears, the new First Lady said, Oh, Jackie, you know we never even wanted to be vice president, and now, dear God, it's come to this. Oh, what if I hadn't been there? Jacqueline Kennedy said. I was so glad I was there. Johnson instinct has been correct. Words were inept. Mrs. Johnson was ordinarily the essence of tact, yet here she slipped. I don't know what to say, she sobbed, and then she said it. What wounds me most of all is that this should happen in my beloved state of Texas. She had scarcely finished before she realized that her tongue had tripped. Immediately, as she said later, I regretted it. This was no day for Texas chauvinism. Kennedy's death should be what wounded her the most. Her eyes wavered and fell, and she saw the stained glove. She had always envied the way that Jackie wore gloves. She herself usually felt awkward in them and couldn't wait to take them off. This one seemed a part of Jackie, and it was caked with her husband's blood. Can we get someone to help you put on fresh things? Mrs. Johnson asked. Oh, no, Mrs. Kennedy replied. Perhaps later I'll ask Mary Gallagher, but not right now. The three of them sat on the bed, Mrs. Kennedy in the middle. Very interesting. After a pause, Johnson said uncertainly, well, about the swearing in. Lyndon, Mrs. Kennedy began, and took a quick breath. Of all those who had been with her husband, she was the first to accept the future. Oh, excuse me. I'll never call you that again, she said. I mean Mr. President. Honey, I hope you'll call me that for the rest of your life, he said. She was silent. Words were difficult for her too. The fact was that he was now the chief executive, and she resolved never again to address him by his first name. About the swearing in, he repeated, trying again. Oh, yes, I know, she said quickly. She thought she knew. She, too, had seen the old engravings, and she remembered that during her televised hour of the White House for CBS, she had pointed out that Rutherford B. Hayes, whose inauguration day fell on a Sunday, had taken the oath in the Red Room. The ceremony could be anywhere. It could be held right here, and evidently it was going to be. She said, Yes, what's going to happen? I've arranged for a judge, an old friend of mine, Judge Hughes, to come, he answered. She'll be here in about an hour. So why don't you lie down and freshen up and everything? We'll leave you alone. All right, she said mindlessly, and they went out, closing the bedroom door. Alone, she smoked a cigarette, staring vacantly into space, and then the full force struck her. An hour, she thought. My God, do I have to wait an hour? Seeing Johnson, McHugh guessed correctly that he had not erred. Seeing Johnson, McHugh guessed correctly that he had erred in not opening the powder room door earlier. Johnson was aboard. If an oath had to be administered on the plane, the general inquired, why couldn't the ceremony be held in the air? It was a reasonable question. He received no satisfactory answer. Instead, a maddening discussion about lens angles and close-ups had begun. The concern was arising in several minds that they were about to witness a spectacle which was bound to involve President Kennedy's widow. Independently of them, the widow was reaching the same conclusion. After the Johnsons' departure, she noticed that her Austin clothes had been carefully laid out on the other bed. A white dress, white jacket, and black shoes. She was left with the feeling that they wanted her to look immaculate in the inauguration picture. Johnson had given careful attention to his own appearance, but this preoccupation may easily be misinterpreted. If the oath was to dramatize the stability of the American system of government, then the show had better be a good show. And if continuity was to be the theme, Jacqueline Kennedy's presence was desirable, however tormenting it might be for her. O'Donnell and O'Brien were sitting opposite the new president and first lady. The Constitution puts me in the White House, but you two are free to make your own choice, he said to Ken and Larry. I want to urge you to stay and stand shoulder to shoulder with me. I need you more than you need me, and more than Kennedy needed you. O'Brien was squirming. He had been chivied enough. Hell, let's talk about this later, he thought. But Johnson, as he recalled afterward, was very definitely in a take-charge mood. Mrs. Johnson, who was to have no memory of these things, felt that everybody was doing his utmost best in a difficult situation. The others were to recollect that they did their best to interrupt her husband and that he wound up, continued to steamroller ahead. O'Brien broke in to describe the coroner's behavior and the need for immediate departure. No, I've talked to the Attorney General, and it's his opinion that I should be sworn in here, Johnson replied. With each passing moment, his version of his conversation with Hickory Hill was growing stronger. I'm expecting a judge, a woman, a friend, he said, and he added, she's a Kennedy appointee. Then the realization hit O'Brien. This man is President of the United States. Larry's opposition ceased. He closed his eyes, praying that the judge arrived before the police. O'Donnell was harder to shake. He couldn't see why Kennedy people should be involved in a Johnson ceremony. In his opinion, the presence of the two groups was a matter of pure chance. The new president kept insisting that he would have held the plane for Mrs. Kennedy. There can be little doubt that he had intended to do that from the outset, but Ken was skeptical. He was convinced that if the judge had reached the airport before the hearse, Johnson would have taken off without them. He kept remembering the struggle at Parkland, and his face tightened more. To Ted Clifton, he looked wolf-like. Clifton heard O'Donnell saying over and over, we've got to go, we've got to get out of here, we can't wait. Each time Johnson's reply was the same. No, I have word from the Attorney General. Later, when Clifton learned that Attorney General Kennedy disavowed advising a Dallas oath, a disavowal strongly supported by Kennedy's open words to Katzenbach, Lyndon wants to be sworn in Texas, he concluded that the new president must have meant Attorney General Waggoner Carr of Texas. But both O'Brien and O'Donnell clearly heard President Johnson say Bobby. Bob Kennedy was the one man who could have persuaded O'Donnell to withdraw his objections. If Bob Kennedy wanted the new president sworn in Dallas, and the Kennedy people never dreamt that Johnson might have misunderstood the Attorney General, though he apparently had, they would just have to sweat out the judge's arrival. They only hoped she would hurry. To Clifton, as to O'Brien, the possibility that the slain president's body might be kidnapped seemed very real. After Judge Sarah Hughes arrived, Johnson dispatched men to round up the witnesses. Then he himself took over that job. Gesticulating broadly, he announced, if anybody wants to join in the swearing-in ceremony, I would be happy and proud to have you. There was no stampede. 26,000's regular passengers hung back. Their aloofness can only be understood in the context of 2:40 p.m. Though the assassin had been caught, 40 minutes would pass before the networks even announced that a suspect had been arrested. In the absence of information, there was a general revulsion, not only toward Dallas, but toward the entire state of Texas. Lyndon Johnson, the most famous of Texans, was the innocent victim of that visceral reaction, and photographer Cecil Stoughton's subsequent negatives are stark evidence of what Larry O'Brien called the tension of the plane. The spectators who were to be framed in Stoughton's lens were a lopsided group. Despite the width of the Hasselblad lens, it did not record the presence of a single male Kennedy aide. The only Kennedy man there, Dr. Berkeley, stood behind somebody else. Godfrey McHugh was beside John Kennedy's coffin, standing rigidly at attention. Ken O'Donnell withdrew to the corridor. Larry O'Brien participated in setting up the ritual that Lyndon Johnson had said Bob Kennedy wanted. Then he retreated behind Sarah Hughes. The feeling extended to members of the permanent presidential staff. The crewman had quietly retired. Swindoll pressed his face against Roy Kellerman's broad back. As he explained afterward, "I just didn't want to be in the picture. I didn't belong to the Lyndon Johnson team. My president was in that box." President Johnson did not deserve this. To a man of his hypersensitivity, such treatment was deeply wounding. More important, it was an affront to the presidency. The coexistence of the two administrations in an oppressive airplane, and the fact that most of these same individuals had battled one another 3 years earlier in Los Angeles, made tempest inevitable here. There were no villains aboard. The villain was downtown at police headquarters. The focus of the print that Stoughton was to relay within an hour was the classic, pain-torn profile of Mrs. John F. Kennedy. It was her presence that the man about to be sworn had coveted most. He wanted her beside him, and he said so to everyone within earshot. In the end, she appeared, but the decision was to be hers. She understood the symbols of authority, the need for some semblance of national majesty after the disaster, and so she came. Neither O'Donnell nor O'Brien contemplated a role in the ceremony for her. O'Donnell, in fact, was vehemently opposed to it. But Johnson told Sarah Hughes, "We'll wait for Mrs. Kennedy. I want her here." Stoughton suggested that she stand on one side of him and Mrs. Johnson on the other. Johnson nodded. He was becoming impatient, though. He glanced at the bedroom door, glanced again, and said decisively, "Just a minute. I'm going to get her." At that instant, the door opened, and the widowed First Lady stepped out. Johnson introduced her to Sarah Hughes and then drew her to his left side. "Is this the way you want us?" he inquired of Stoughton. The little photographer, drenched with perspiration, called out instructions. A voice from the semicircle of witnesses asked, "What about a Bible?" There was a pause, in which everyone looked at everyone else. Then Joe Ayers reassured them. President Kennedy always carried his personal Bible under the lid of the table between the two beds in his cabin. The cover was of tooled leather. The edges were hand-sewn. On the front, there was a gold cross, and on the inside cover, the tiny sewn black-on-black initials, JFK. On flights alone, the president had read it evenings before snapping off the nightlight. Sarah Hughes regarded it dubiously. Kennedy, she remembered, had quoted the Bible a lot. This must be his. After all, this was his plane, and that meant it was probably Catholic. Interesting. Catholics do have the apocryphal books that are additions to what Protestants regard as the complete Bible. She hesitated, then decided it would be all right. President Johnson's audience was not rapt. Most of them didn't hear a word. Stoughton was almost drowning in his own sweat because his camera was defective. His first frame was a dud. Nothing snapped. Recovering from the sickening silence, he guessed that a small pin inside had failed to make proper contact. He twisted the film advance lever forward and back, jiggled the works, and heard a click. Mary Gallagher was watching Ken O'Donnell, who was pacing the corridor outside the bedroom like a caged tiger. His hands clapped over his ears as though to block the oath. Oh, you can just picture it. I don't even want to hear it. I don't want to hear that man take the oath. You can just picture his anger. Ken was thinking of Jackie. She's being used. She's being used. Larry O'Brien stared at Jack Valenti. There was a new zeal about him, and O'Brien, noticing his throbbing veins in his neck, thought, well, he's on his way too. Muggsy O'Leary saw Valenti as well. At the same time, it occurred to Muggsy that there had never been so many Texans in the stateroom. He thought, it's all over for us. The pressure of dank bodies, the soaring temperature, and the stuffiness of the cabin gave it the oppressive atmosphere of a sudatorium. Mrs. Johnson alone was unconscious of the humidity. She was thinking, this is a moment which is altogether dreamlike, because the thing is so unreal. We're just like characters in a play. This is the beginning of something for us that's dreadful and heavy, and you don't know what it holds. We're stepping into a strange new world. It has the quality of a dream, she thought again, and yet it isn't a dream at all. The president embraced his wife and Jacqueline Kennedy. Now sit down here, honey, Johnson said to the widowed First Lady, steering her toward the seat Stoughton had just vacated. Swindle's engines were shrieking, and Johnson, seeking into the presidential chair, said to Lem Johns, let her roll. Johnson ordered a bowl of bouillon, and Mrs. Johnson had crackers. Mrs. Kennedy rose, saying politely, excuse me. She didn't want to offend the Johnsons, but a refrain kept running through her mind. I'm not going to be in here. I'm going back there. Scurrying down the corridor, she saw Ken, Larry, Dave, and Godfrey standing around the coffin. She sat in one of the two seats opposite, and Ken joined her. Their eyes met, and she began to cry. It was the first time she had wept. The tears came in a flood, and for a long time she couldn't speak. Tripping down the ramp steps, Sarah Hughes was hailed by a self-assured man. She remembers him as rather officious, who pointed at the black binding in her hand and said, do you want that? She shook her head. How about this? He inquired, fingering a 3x5 card on which the text of the oath had been written. Neither belonged to her, and so she surrendered them, assuming that he was some sort of security man. He wasn't. His identity is a riddle. His venture required enterprise and luck. The spoils, however, were priceless. He left the airport with a pair of unique souvenirs. The file card is an archivist's curiosity of interest only to collectors and museums. The book, however, is something more. It was private property, and at this writing, it remains untraced. The last item of Kennedy memorabilia to be left in Dallas. His most cherished personal possession was his Bible. Wow. Well, that is where we are going to leave it for today. So we got from the hospital to Love Field, through the oath of office, and now the plane is about to take off. Please leave in the comments what stands out to you. What details hadn't you heard before? What did you think of the standoff at the Parkland emergency room in the corridor there? So much high drama, so many emotions. And then to get onto the plane and have the back and forth, literally physically back and forth, that one aide moving back and forth, drama between the two camps of we have to leave, they're gonna try to take the body, and no, I want to take the oath of office right now. Lyndon being so certain that he wanted to take the oath of office and make it official while he was in Dallas. Lots of good information in this. Let me know in the comments if you're enjoying it. And next time, we will continue on the flight from Dallas to Washington. So come back for that. We'll see you next time. Bye.